Hi guys, I was kind of wishing for some sunshine today, but it's been a little cloudy here as we're filming these stories. Today you have a special treat. Sydney is going to read you your story today. So tune in to hear about Mrs. Tittlemouse.
All right, it's day 3 of Beatrix Potter, and we are reading The Tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse. Isn't she so cute? All right, let's get started. Once upon a time, there was a wood mouse, and her name was Mrs. Tittlemouse. She lived in a bank under a hedge. Such a funny house. There were yards and yards and yards of sandy passages leading to storerooms and nut cellars and seed cellars, all amongst the roots of the hedge. There was a kitchen, a parlor, a pantry, and a larder. Also, there was Mrs. Tittlemouse's bedroom where she slept in a little box bed. Mrs. Tittlemouse was a most terribly tidy, particular little mouse, so she really liked for things to be really clean. Always sweeping and dusting the soft sandy floors. Sometimes a beetle lost its way in the passages. Shh, shh, little dirty feet, said Miss Tittlemouse, clattering her dustpan. One day, a little old woman ran up and down in a spotty red cloak. "Your house is on fire, Mother Ladybird! Fly away home to your children!" Another day, a big, fat spider came in to shelter from the rain. "Beg pardon, is this not Miss Muffet's? Go away, you big, bold spider, leaving ends of cobweb all over my nice, clean house." She bundled the spider out at a window. He let himself down the hedge with a long, thin bit of string. Mrs. Tittlemouse went on her way to a distant storeroom to fetch cherry stones and thistledown seed for dinner. All along the passage she sniffed and looked at the floor. "I smell a spot of honey. Is it the cowslips outside in the hedge? I'm sure I can see the markings of little dirty feet." Suddenly, round the corner she met Babbity Bumble. "Zzz, buzz, buzz," said the bumblebee. Miss Tittlemouse looked at her severely. She wished that she had a broom. "Good day, Babbity Bumble. I should be glad to buy some beeswax. But what are you doing down here? Why do you always come in at a window and say bzz, bzz, bzz?" Mrs. Tittlemouse began to get cross, which means she started to get into a bad mood. "Zzz, whiz, whiz," replied Babbity Bumble in a peevish squeak. She sidled down the passage and disappeared into a storeroom, which had been used for acorns. Miss Tittlemouse had eaten the acorns before Christmas. The storeroom ought to have been empty, but it was full of untidy, dry moss. Miss Tittlemouse began to pull out the moss. 3 or 4 other bees put their heads out and buzzed fiercely. "I am not in the habit of letting lodgings. This is an intrusion," said Miss Tittlemouse. "I will have them turned out. Buzz, buzz, buzz. I wonder who would help me. Buzz, whiz, whiz. I will not have Mr. Jackson. He never wipes his feet." Miss Tittlemouse decided to leave the bees until after dinner. When she got back to the parlor, she heard someone coughing in a fat voice, and there sat Mr. Jackson himself. He was sitting all over a small rocking chair, twiddling his thumbs and smiling, with his feet on the fender. He lived in a drain below the hedge in a very dirty, wet ditch. So there's Mr. Jackson. "How do you do, Mr. Jackson? Dearie me, you have gotten very wet." Thank you, Miss Tittlemouse. I'll sit a while and dry myself," said Mr. Jackson. He sat and smiled, and the water dripped off his coattails. Miss Tittlemouse went around with a mop. He sat such a while that he had to be asked if he would take some dinner. First she offered him cherry stones. Thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. No teeth, no teeth." So he couldn't eat them. Said Mr. Jackson. He opened his mouth most unnecessarily wide. He certainly had not a tooth in his head. Then she offered him some thistledown seed. "Tiddly widdly widdly, poof, poof, puff," said Mr. Jackson. He blew the thistledown all over the room. Thank you. Mrs. Tittlemouse, now what I really, really should like would be a little dish of honey. I'm afraid I have not got any, Mr. Jackson, said Mrs. Tittlemouse. Tiddly widdly widdly, Miss Tittlemouse, said the smiling Mr. Jackson. I can smell it. That is why I came to call. Mr. Jackson rose ponderously from the table and began to look into the cupboards. Miss Tittlemouse followed him with a dishcloth to wipe his large wet footmarks off the parlor floor. So he is big and dirty and wet, and he's messing up her big, clean house. When he had convinced himself that there was no honey in the cupboards, he began to walk down the passage. So he's spreading his mess everywhere. Indeed, indeed, you will stick fast, Mr. Jackson. Tiddly widdly widdly, Miss Tittlemouse. First, he squeezed into the pantry. Tiddly widdly widdly. No honey, Mrs. Tittlemouse. There were 3 creepy crawly people hiding in the plate rack. 2 of them got away, but the littlest one he caught. Then he squeezed into the larder. Miss Butterfly was tasting the sugar, but she flew away out of the window. Tiddly widdly widdly, Miss Tittlemouse, you seem to have plenty of visitors. And without any invitation, said Miss Tittlemouse. They went along the sandy passage. Tiddly widdly, buzz, whiz, whiz. He met Babbity round a corner and snapped her up and put her down again. I do not like bumblebees. They are over bristles, said Mr. Jackson, wiping his mouth with his coat sleeve. Get out, you nasty old toad, shrieked Bibbidi Bumble. I shall go distracted, scolded Miss Tittlemouse. She shut herself up in the nut cellar while Mr. Jackson pulled out the bee's nest. He seemed to have no objection to stings. When Miss Tittlemouse ventured to come out, everyone had gone away. But the untidiness was something dreadful. Never did I see such a mess. Smears of honey and moss and thistledown and marks of big and little dirty feet all over my nice clean house. She gathered up the moss and the remains of the beeswax, and she went out and fetched some twigs to partly close up the front door. I shall make it too small for Mr. Jackson. She fetched soft soap and a flannel, so like a washcloth, and a new scrubbing brush from the storeroom, but she was too tired to do any more. First she fell asleep in her chair, then she went to bed. Will it ever be tidy again? Said poor Mrs. Tittlemouse. Next morning she got up very early and began a spring cleaning which lasted a fortnight. Remember, a fortnight is 2 weeks, so she cleaned for 2 weeks. She swept and scrubbed and dusted, and she rubbed up the furniture with beeswax and polished her little tin spoons. When it was all beautifully neat and clean, she gave a party to 5 other little mice without Mr. Jackson. He smelt the party and he came up with a bang, but he could not squeeze in at the door. So they handed him out acorn cupfuls of honeydew through the window, and he was not at all offended. He sat outside in the sun and said, Tiddly widdly widdly, your very good health, Mrs. Tittlemouse. The end. So that was a cute little story about a cute little mouse who did not like her house to get dirty, but it did, and we see how she reacted. And that's the end. Tune back in tomorrow for another story.